All right. Okay, so the first part of this, I'm just going to really go through the entire interface as much as reasonably possible. I'm going to go through like the really important stuff at first, but the most important thing I would say right off the bat is making sure that when you open a document in Animate, you select ActionScript 3.0 because that's the coding that we're going to be working with. So make sure you select ActionScript 3.0 upon opening the document. Okay, so here's our interface. I'm going to go ahead and save right away, just on my desktop here. Okay, all right. So one of the main areas here is this Properties palette. And so that's going to be up here on the upper right. And so opening this palette's going to allow you to do different things depending on what you have clicked on in the interface. So if I click on an object, I'll have different options for properties. If I have really nothing clicked on, I'll have completely different options as well. So I have nothing clicked on at this point, and my main option here is the size of the piece, right? So I can adjust the size of this document. Right, so I can hit 500 by 500 pixels. That's really where I usually start with a square. You can do other things as well. You can adjust the frame rate of the document, right? So this is 24 frames per second. So down here in the timeline, this is the timeline area. I'll bring it up. Down here in the timeline, it looks very similar to kind of what my drawing was on the board. Mine was, of course, a little bit more crude, but this kind of shows you the number of frames on the timeline here, just this number on the very bottom, and then this number here is your how many seconds, right? So I have 24 frames between 0 and 1 second in this piece, etc. So it'll show you both of those conversions there in the timeline. Now, why that's important really is frames per second can determine how big or small your file is. So if you're working with like a website and they have ad space on their site that you are doing an animation piece for that website, you're gonna want to make sure your file is as small as possible, and they specify certain file sizes that they require designers to adhere to because of loading times on their web page, right? So if users visit their web page and the loading times are high, that would affect their search engine optimization of their website, and so they sort of limit advertisers in that way. And then when a website is really slow to load, then it's going to hurt its ranking on that Google search results when people go to search. The first thing I would do if my file was too large for something like that is adjust the frame rate. I would make it. I would bring it as low as to 18 frames per second. You can even go to like 16. And Animate used to default to, I believe, 12 or 14, something like that. So it was pretty low. So actually 24 frames per second is pretty high. The thing you'll sacrifice with that is the smoothness of the animations, right? So the less frames, the more almost choppy it is. But the human eye can not decipher more than, I believe, 16 to 18 frames per second anyhow. So you're not really hurting much there if you lower this to something like that. Your stage background. So this is your stage here. You can change the color of that background, or whatever kind of color you choose. Typically, I do an image for the background, so I'll always keep it white. So for this instance, I'll keep it white for now. Some of the shortcut options here so I will always use the hand tool, so holding the space bar and clicking and dragging around, that's one I always use. Other tools too, drag this out and see if that'll drag. Okay, so other tools here, they put the tools on the right side, which is totally the opposite of most of the defaults for other Adobe software. But a lot of the tools are very similar looking. So you have a lasso tool. Underneath this lasso tool, if you click and hold, you're going to have the polygon and the magic wand tool. You're going to have the pen tool here. You can add or delete anchor points, and I'll show you kind of how the drawing works in this software. It's a little bit different from Illustrator, but the same at the same time. So it's sort of like a merge between Photoshop and Illustrator, the way drawing tools work here. It's really unusual. You have your typical selection tool that has a little bit of the same but different aspects to it in this software. And the direct selection tool, they call it the sub-selection tool in this program. Of course, your type tool, your text tool is going to be something that you use often as well. And then your basic shapes too, rectangles and circles and so on and so forth. But I'll show you all the drawing tools. They're a little bit odd in this program, so they're a little bit different. Your other main area here will be your Swatches Palette, so this will be a place you'll come. You could add swatches, of course, just like any other Adobe software program, just the same. But keep in mind that there is no CMYK conversions in this software, because this is all like digitally based. So you're going to have like web conversion colors and stuff. So yeah, so that. Okay. Now the main area here, the area that I work in, that you'll be working in the most, is this timeline. This timeline and the properties palette will be two of your main areas. The timeline being the one you'll spend probably the most time. Between the timeline and moving your content on the stage, that'll be like the main crux of it. So layers are really important in the timeline. Naming your layers is especially important in staying organized in that way, because these layers can really grow and grow and grow. There are methods to keeping your layers kind of smaller, and I'll show you those methods too. And that is kind of nesting your animations within other animation objects, which is something that you can do to sort of keep this manageable down here. Let me get there. Adding your layers, just adding as many as you want. That's very much the same as Photoshop, Illustrator, everything else. And another thing I recommend is actually shift-clicking any layers that you'd like to group and actually grouping those layers. So you can actually drag these into the folder here that you can open and collapse, and this helps just kind of keep things organized. So if you have like a bunch of animations going on in the background and they're perfect, and you don't really want to accidentally be clicking around here and dumping it in the deleting it or something, you can use a folder to just group that stuff together and lock it up. So here's your lock icon that can lock any of your content at any time. All right, so we'll kind of go through that a little bit. And what I want to do is first of all show you a shape tween. So there's a couple different types of tweens in the software. There's a classic tween, and then there's a shape tween, and then there's a motion tween. I only work specifically in the classic and the shape tweens, because the classic tween allows you to use action script on it. A motion tween is basically just motion. You can't add any interactivity to an object. And I always like to keep my options open just in case I want something to be interactive at the end of the day. I only work with the classic and the shape tweens, all right? So, and then the shape tween I don't hardly ever work with at all because you have no real control over that. So I'm going to show you what a shape tween is right now. I'm going to start basically, probably, I'm just going to do that, that sort of sample that I was working on. So I grabbed the rectangle tool, and I'm creating this rectangle object, but I'm actually holding Shift to constrain the proportions to create just a basic square. Once I get my direct selection tool and click that square, I'll go up to my swatches and select a color. And so you'll notice one thing here is that it defaults a stroke on this object, right? So and now I can, with my selection tool, select just the stroke, and it has, let me see if you can see it pretty good. Yeah, it has like this checkered pattern to it. Separately from this area here, now this has the checkered pattern, so I can actually use my selection tool and select just the stroke or just the inside piece of it separately. That's one weird drawing tool thing. If I wanted to select both the stroke and the object, I would just double click the object and it's going to select both the stroke and the center. So that's an odd thing it does for the drawing tools. Another important thing to keep in mind is in my properties palette, things changed. So it tells me what I have selected. So I have a basic shape. It's giving me the approximate size and coordinates of it on the panel. Now I can actually increase or decrease this stroke using this little slider here. I can I can delete the stroke if I'd like. I can change the stroke type, things like that, right? So you can do things in the properties palette that you would not normally be able to do outside of it, especially in like something like Illustrator or something like that, where you actually have like a stroke dialog box. So with this shape selected, I have a fill and a stroke color here. So in order to get rid of this stroke, you can either click it and delete it, or you can change the stroke color and then hit this kind of no color option there in the top right corner of this box. All right. So I'll undo that and I'll show you another weird aspect of it, and that is you can actually click and drag this selection tool here and actually select a part of that square, and then I can actually like move it off of there. So now it kind of acts like clay. I kind of describe it as clay, which is interesting. Another interesting thing you can do is, and it's really just the strangest thing, is I can take another shape and draw over this, and right, so now I've drawn over this, and now I can actually move this, and it just totally cuts out the bottom part of it, just sort of like a clay ball, right? It's really odd. So that's why I don't really like the drawing tools in this software. If you have some kind of drawing that you want to bring in, I recommend just taking something in Illustrator and dragging and dropping in. You can drag and drop, you can import Illustrator files, you can import layers within Illustrator files. So if your Illustrator file has like 10 layers, you can import the layers separately, however you want. But this is just something to keep in mind. And as you start talking about your concepts later on, we'll kind of figure things out how to tackle it in those different ways. But let's just say this is something I'm happy with, right? And I want to animate this thing, okay? So what I want to do here is actually see that I have artwork here on the background layer. I'll call it shape. So I'll just change it. On the shape layer, on frame 1, this is my artwork. And so what I want to do is between frame 1 and frame 30, I want this to kind of do something, right? I want to shape tween it. So what I'll do is on frame 30, I'm going to hit Control-click. I'm going to insert keyframe. Now, so a keyframe is a frame where a change occurs in the artwork on that layer, okay? If I were just to, and I'll show you. All right, so what happens is once I add the keyframe, the artwork is copied over from the original keyframe that I added this new keyframe from. And so you can see that on the timeline how it's playing out by seeing that there's an object here with this little dot, and that's a keyframe symbol, and then here's the keyframe symbol here. All this gray area here between this symbol and this symbol is the same artwork, so I'll show you kind of what that means. I'll just delete off this keyframe this part, okay? So now you can see that frame 1 through 29, I have this green dot, and then 30, it's gone, okay? So that's a change. So that's a change in the keyframe, right? Let me just do another like little change. I'll just delete a little bit of that off. So what's going to happen between frame 1 and frame 30 once I put a tween in there? God only knows. I have no idea because the Shape Tween you have zero control over. So the machine is just going to kind of make it morph in from one to the other, and it's kind of a surprise. So to add the tween, you hit Control click in the area, in this gray area between the two keyframes. Okay, so I'm control clicking that, and I'm going to hit Create Shape Tween, and then this is kind of the surprise. So, oops, where's my timeline? Okay. All right. So what you can do is hit Return, and you can see kind of how this thing plays out. So return over and over again will just play this at full speed. So the Shape Tween really gives you no control whatsoever. Let's just say we want this. Now we have the tween added, so let me go to frame 1 and let me see if I can actually select. I'll delete this, and then maybe I'll kind of cut this up a little bit and this up a little bit. So I've started making changes to my keyframe on 1, and I could even make changes on my keyframe on 30. And the tween is still created, so I created the tween. Nothing's broken in between those frames. And I can actually just play this out, and it sort of changes. Right, so the animation, it just readjusted itself to match what the beginning and the end were from an artwork perspective standpoint. Okay. Now let's say now you can take this concept of changing from one point to the other in the timeline and apply different things to it, right? So I can say this color, maybe I'll change it here, and then see kind of what happens. Right, so now I'm going from a blue to like a green color up there in the corner. Let's say this changes from, I mean, maybe there. I'm not sure, I just clicked a bunch of stuff. So yeah, the point is I literally have no control over what's happening in this. So that's why I never hardly use it. Unless I want something sort of to surprise me. Maybe it's a background or something of geometric shapes moving into infinity and constantly, let's just say, and that sort of thing. So, you know, I can actually add more keyframes down the timeline, and if I wanted more changes to happen, right? So if I were to go to frame 50, hit Control click, and do Insert Keyframe again, it's going to add another copy of this artwork onto frame 50, and you're going to have a keyframe between this number 30 and 50 without a tween, okay? And then you can just make your adds and you know, changes to the artwork from on frame 50, and then add a shape tween here, and then kind of see what happens. So you're kind of just adding more motion to it. What you do with this file, so this is an FLA file. So the FLA file is the native file, so this is equivalent to like an InDesign file, right? And you'll see more because we have a library here, and we can input content just like an InDesign to use in the FLA file. The only caveat is you don't have to link. Okay, so there's no risk of breaking links in this because once it's in here, it's in here. The bad part is that you can't edit the original. So like if you had a Photoshop document in here and you used you wanted to Photoshop the guy's shirt or something to be red instead of green or whatever, you have to go back to the Photoshop document. You can't just open the link inside of the FLA file. So that's just something to keep in mind. You can't really, there's no links involved here. You're just actually placing the artwork as is right here in the library. But we'll get to that stuff later. But just keep in mind that there's very similar aspects of this to InDesign. All right. So that's the FLA file. That's the working file. So what you want to do to actually send this to somebody in the end is you go to File, Export, and then Export Video. So you can export this video, and let's see here, and I'll just do my desktop export. Oh, that's an MOV file. I'm sorry. Let me try that again. Export movie? Yeah, export movie. I'm sorry. Not video, export movie. So file export movie, that will create the SWF file, which is what we want to work with. So the SWF file, and I'll call it, I'll say class sample SWF. So that is going to be the file that you would then give to an advertiser or something like that to put on their website and that sort of thing in the end. And let me just kind of close this out before it crushes my computer. There we go. You can see you can create an MOV file, right? That was what I did with exporting the video. But the SWF file, this is all contained. So the artwork is actually contained in here. And you can notice that this is just going to repeat to infinity over and over and over again. So there is no stopping in this. This is just in a closed loop, kind of infinite loop of play. Now eventually we'll add a stop frame to the end of our animations or whatever. Think about it this way: if you start with an interface, your stop frame might be frame 1. And then if you click a button, then it'll go to frame 2 that has some kind of change in that artwork that shows a different image or something like that. Whatever you want that button to do or show or display or open, that type of thing. So keep that in mind. Your stop could be at the very beginning, and typically it is. A lot of mine are like that, where maybe I do like an intro animation and then it stops, and then an interface is static there, and then I expect the user to make a choice, a click of some type. So that's the SWF file. That's really just the function. It's the equivalent of a PDF, really, from an InDesign document. All right. Let me just. Why is this here? Okay, whatever. All right. So that's that in a nutshell. I will probably never show you Shape Tweens again because these are just kind of, I don't really see any point in them, but that's just because maybe it's just not really my style. So I just cleared the keyframes. Now this will show you kind of a sample, right, of what this is the only indication of artwork not being on a keyframe in your timeline. This circle that used to be solid with artwork on the stage, it's just hollow now. That's the only indication they really give you. So be really careful, to get yourself frustrated by clicking on other layers and that type of thing. Be sure to check on your timeline to see if there's even art on these layers that you might be clicking on, or maybe you copied art from one layer to the other inadvertently, and now that layer that you were working with is empty. That's definitely something to keep in mind and watch out for. All right, so let me actually hit remove frames. There we go. So now I'm starting back at my basic point. So the next really important, so that kind of gives you sort of the gist of how animation is working here. The next piece I want to show you is the classic tween, and so I do have working files, but and they're going to be on a future demo. So I'm sorry, the future assignment. But really, I'll show you kind of what I'm starting with. They're just 2 PNG files, right? And so one PNG file is this isolated flower image, and I have another PNG file where I have this flower kind of on a background. So this isolated flower image, you can see, they're all PNGs. This one's got transparency. This one does not. For this piece, what I want to do first, actually in Photoshop, is trim all these pixels. So I'm going to go to Image Trim, and I'm going to hit Transparent Pixels, and I'll save that. Because the thing is that when I bring this artwork in, I don't want to be kind of wrestling around with an image that has a lot of area to work with. So if I was to paste this in as is, it would be like as big as the transparent area. So I want to kind of reduce the transparent area so I don't inadvertently click on a blank area that might select the layer and that sort of thing. So what I'll do first, and you can bring things in a couple ways. What I'll do first is I'll just go to File, Import. You can import to the stage, right, which is this big white blank area. And you can import to the library. So that's just maybe your content you're collecting for future use within the software, so you don't have to import things as you come in. You already have your idea and your sketch and everything. So maybe you're just importing all of your content at once. So I'm going to select both of those pieces, right, just as if I'm going to import all that content at once. Go to my library and see I have my images here. So I can click on them and see a thumbnail of what I have to work with here. So I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to call it background. And for the classic tween then. And I'm going to just drag out this background image. And so the first thing I'll do is actually I will go up into Modify Transform and hit Free Transform. So anything now that I bring in, I'll be able to just free transform it just by default now. And I'm just going to kind of move this guy around here like that. And actually what I'm going to do is lock it up. So I'm going to hit this lock button so I don't ever have to deal with that again. So I don't ever have to accidentally click on it or bad things happening like that. Now I know for sure that I want to bring this flower in, so I'm going to bring the flower in separate. Bring that in like that. All right, so the first thing I want to do is maybe I'm going to do, well actually, so the first thing I really have to do is convert this to a symbol. So this is something that this is like probably the second most important thing besides selecting ActionScript 3.0 is every object that you bring in, whether it be a photo or a drawing or something like that, you always want to convert it to a movie clip symbol. Because if I don't, and I'll select my properties palette here, it's going to default to a bitmap symbol, or not even a symbol at all, just a bitmap image. And for bitmap images, you cannot animate them. They look exactly the same, but you can't animate them. So convert this to a symbol by control-clicking the object and going down here to this option that says Convert to Symbol. You can also shortcut it by hitting F8. It says right for you here. But converting it to a symbol, when I click that button, it's going to bring me to this menu dialog box. And this looks a lot more intimidating than it actually is. Really what this is saying is you can name this symbol, which isn't really necessarily that important right now, because it really isn't actually important at all, but I'll just do it. There's two names to a symbol, and so this is the non-important one. I'll show you the more important one later. That's when you're using it for buttons and stuff. You have to actually tell it, this is a button that I want it to do this thing in the code. But we'll go through all that later. A lot easier than it sounds. Here's where you would select the type of symbol, right? So it defaults to movie clip, which is great. Button symbol, we'll go through those, and those are just fine to use, and there's a lot of use for them. So movie clip symbol and hitting OK. Now this is in the properties palette, a movie clip symbol. This is where the naming is important in this part. When you say instance name right here, this is what ActionScript is going to say that this object is clickable and we want it to do something. So what I would do is actually just give it a name here in the properties palette. So I'll say, call it flower spin. All right, and there's more to that palette, but that's all for now. I'll just keep this open. So down here we have this flower piece. I'll make this a little bit smaller. So, and I'm going to put it off the stage for the time being. You can see this line defining the stage now. It's just thin black line here. So I'll have this starting off on frame 1 off the stage, and then I'll go to frame 30, and I'm going to, again, control click and then hit insert keyframe. All right, so frame 30, now you can see here, frame 30, I have my artwork on frame 30, and I want it to end up kind of coming over here. Here we go. I want to end up coming over there and getting larger, right? So I want it to move from point A to point B and grow all the way in between. So here's my ending point, and here's my starting point. It's down here, and then it's going to end up here and larger. One thing you'll notice, though, is that when I created that, that new frame, that new keyframe down here on 30, all of the artwork still for the background is stuck on frame 1, so my background is missing. So in order to extend background 1 all the way up until the end of this animation, which is frame 30 at this point, could be longer if I create more stuff down the road, is to click on frame 30 on the background layer and hit control click and select insert frame. All right, so now our background is there. It's throughout the whole entire film, and we still have the artwork jumping from one point to the other, frame 1 to frame 30, kind of just like so. So what I'm going to do then is, just like the Shape Tween, I'm going to actually hit Classic Tween. So between these two keyframes, I'm going to control click, hit create Classic Tween. All right, and there it's done. So it kind of grows from one point to the other. I'll actually move it a little bit. I'll move this around. So on frame 30, I'm going to move this here, so it'll end there. And then in the beginning, I'll click that keyframe, see my selection on the desktop work, and I'll just make that go over here. So there's the beginning and there's the end. So our tween is locked in, so we can kind of make changes on either end of that tween to change it up a little bit. So that's really it. That is Classic Tween at its simplest. Let me unlock this background and select frame 1, right? And then actually I'll select the whole thing, and I'll kind of nudge this sort of over to the right. I'll lock it back up again, so we can sort of focus on this flower part. So there's a couple things you can do to sort of light this up a little bit. On your timeline, what you can do is something called an ease in and ease out. And that adds a quality to your animation so it's not so one-speeded like that is right now. What you can do is actually click on the tween in the timeline, and you can see then that the Properties palette again changes. And right here under tweening, you're going to see there's an option for Classic Ease. So if I click that box, I can select no ease, classic ease, ease in, ease out. These are the two I'm going to demonstrate. Ease in, it gives you a bunch of different options for easing in. And I'll show you the really basic one, though, is this top option. So I'll double click it, and then it'll apply the ease in. And I'll show you what it does. So see how it kind of is slowly to get up and go in the beginning? That's what ease in does. Is it sort of is like it's almost like a car stopped at a traffic light, and then it just starts moving, and then it gets faster and faster towards the very end. So that's one aspect of it. Now let me show you what ease out does. It's actually the exact opposite. So if I select the Properties palette again and it changes the ease to ease out and double click that top option, now it slows down at the end, sort of like you're putting on your brakes towards the light, something like that. So easing in and easing out is again like once you get the core of your animation done and your timing is just fine, then you can add some little tweaks at the end, like easing in and easing out, to sort of refine it a little bit to make it more interesting. for an interactive piece. So those are those options. You can, let's see, you can select these different options for easing out too. So you can see sort of the ease of the ease out here, this just by this curve. So you can actually kind of pick these other options, and it should be a little bit more forceful here. So let me try that and see what kind of effect that is. Yeah, so it's really quick up front and then very slow towards the tail end. So playing with these easing options is something that'll give you a whole different feel once you start applying it. So we showed a little bit of scale, right? So this object grew from small to large, and that's just the really basic of the basic. Another option you can do, again in the Properties palette, if I were to go to this last frame, and let me just add another keyframe down the row. So I'm going to go to like frame 60 and control click and insert another keyframe. So same thing happened again, right? Is our object then ended up on frame 60 and our background kind of got lost. I'll actually I'll click and hold and drag this frame all the way down to 60, so that it can add it to this last piece here. So it kind of you can kind of click and stretch the arc too. So back to this flower piece. What I'm going to do at this point is actually move this back up here, and then I'm going to just apply a classic tween to it. So it's just going to move and stop up here, and then I want something different to happen. So once I click on it, here in the Properties palette, there's these options called Color Effect, and here's where you can kind of adjust your transparency. And so transparency in this program is called alpha. So it's a little bit different than other programs, but once you hit alpha, you can increase or decrease to whatever kind of transparent percentage you want. So let's just say I'm going to put it at 0, and so between frame 30 and 60, on top of moving to this top corner, it's actually going to fade away. So as it plays out, it sort of fades away at the end. You can apply easing to this, so so that can have an effect as well. So if I click this tween before the motion and fade out tweens here, I'll hit classic ease and then go ease in, and then I'll just reset this back and see kind of how that sort of makes it fade out a little bit. Makes it fade out like a little bit smoother, and it kind of seems to be, I guess, a little slower towards the end. All right, so there's that. Let me actually change the alpha to this to show you another option that there is in this color effect menu, and that is the in this drop down I can actually select tint or brightness. Let me try brightness. So let me have this thing just turn totally black, right? So you can actually affect the color as well. Maybe it goes like subtly brighter, right? So if you wanted, like, let's say you wanted like your background to maybe look like it was flickering in front of a flame or something like that, you can create keyframes down here to sort of mimic that, and then just adjust the brightness of the between the keyframes of the background image subtly for a while. And you could actually have that on a loop to where that background maybe is flickering or something. So there's a couple different ways you can use some of that stuff. There's another option too, and that's called Advanced. And so Advanced actually lets you adjust the red, green, and blue sliders, as well as the alpha too. So if I gave this less red, this would turn into like sort of a teal flower. And then maybe if I reduce the blue or something, it'll give it sort of more of a green, like that. And then so if I play this out, just like the Shape Tween, the color is going to be affected. So that's how you could get it to adjust color a little bit for you there, for your images. Now keep in mind, taking like how we had layers in our Photoshop file, and we showed and hid those shoe layers to show and hide colors in InDesign. You can't really take two different files and pop them in here and then make it, and then have it just know to blend those colors together in that file. So that's sort of a downside of it. The only way to really do some kind of a color blend would be to really mess with your tint here. You can do tint, or you can hit the advanced option and then tweak the color that way. Let me see tint here. Yeah, tint is not so great. You can really just kind of colorize this essentially to whatever kind of color you want. But the thing is that you kind of lose some of the saturation there. But that's really essentially how the color editing works here. And that's one downside of this software compared to After Effects, is After Effects gives you a lot more options to edit color like at the pixel base. But it doesn't give you interactivity, so it's just kind of a hit or miss there. I mean, it just depends on what you want in the end, really. And so I'll switch this to alpha and make this about 30%. All right. So it's 7 o'clock. You guys can take a break real quick because I have some more to show, and then we'll just jump back in and keep moving on this. Is everything making kind of sense so far? I'm gonna